Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Jonas Schorr. I'm co-founder of Urban Impact, and we work on connecting and supporting Europe's emergent urban tech ecosystem. And I have the pleasure today to moderate this really exciting discussion exactly about what that means, what it means when we talk about intelligent cities, and also how new technologies can, should, or maybe shouldn't be used to transform and reshape the way we live in our cities. So, since the idea of the smart city is indeed quite a contentious one, I'm especially grateful for the opportunity to discuss it today here with two pioneers of collaborative innovation, if you can say so. We have Geoff Mulgan and Marleen Stikker, who both need no introduction. Geoff, Marleen, pleasure to have you here with me.
Hi there.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
So you'll both give a short intro to your work. We'll then also learn more about your thinking around technological innovation in cities and follow this by a discussion. So without further ado, Geoff, I would say let's just jump straight into that, into your discussion. Maybe you can also briefly introduce yourself again and also tell us what you're currently working on.
Well, thank you for the invitation, and it's very good to be in Berlin, even if virtually. So my background is of working at various levels of government. I've worked in the city government of London. I worked in the UK national government, running strategy and policy in the Prime Minister's office. I've also worked for the European Commission a long time ago, and currently I'm at University College London. And so one of my long-standing interests is in how you actually get some kind of intelligence into government. There's no shortage of stupidity and folly, and we have our fair share of that at the moment. But the optimist in me thinks we could be on the cusp of really quite important breakthroughs in how a city or a nation or even a whole continent can think and solve its problems. And I want to just briefly share a bit of what I mean by that. What I don't mean is what we've seen with Donald Trump in the last few months, which is ignoring the science, proposing disinfectants to solve COVID and so on. I mean almost the opposite. How do you mobilize the whole of society as a shared brain, a shared intelligence, for observing what's happening in the world, for using models maybe to understand infections of COVID or what might happen to the economy, organizing its memory, a shared memory in a systematic way, organizing creativity and experiment again in a shared way as a commons, and also exercising judgment and wisdom. And a few years ago, I wrote a book on collective intelligence called Big Mind, which tried to set out really a theory of what intelligence at large scale could mean and what that might mean for government, for democracy, for universities, and so on. Now, one of the good things that's happened this year with the COVID crisis is we've begun to see some parts of the world really accelerating in putting those ideas into practice. Other parts of the world, including my country, I think rather left behind. What I mean by this is much more systematic orchestration of just observing the facts, what's happening in terms of infections, through mobilizing data, mobile phone data, credit card data, testing data, and so on. And countries like South Korea have done this very well. It's one of the reasons they were able to control the epidemic much more quickly than other places. Taiwan, even more successful at mobilizing citizen data, again, mobile phone data, organizing digital quarantines, a whole host of tools to try and get to grips with the crisis. And even perhaps slightly surprising places like Bangladesh, 180 million people, has created a collective intelligence data system to help them gather both data on the health aspects, but also the economic aspects, even the well-being aspects of the crisis in real time. And they've achieved a far lower death rate and infection rate and economic harm than countries like the UK, France, Spain, and so on. So we're beginning to see some countries using very smart data, often with citizen engagement, and with clever analytics, but in a completely transparent and open way, which begins to turn the society into something more like a brain. We've also seen much more bottom-up versions of collective intelligence through the crisis. So an example here, which was quite a good one, which I was involved in, was the creation of new platforms to mobilize volunteers to help out. One called Good Sam mobilized 750,000 people in a few days to offer their services to the health service. We've created new circles of support around isolated older people, a bit like what should have been done by Facebook years ago, so people can coordinate who's doing a visit, who's driving someone to a hospital, who's providing food and shopping in a much more orchestrated way, using platforms as genuine social tools rather than only as ways of selling advertising. And across the world, we're beginning to see governments realizing collective intelligence methods are much more perhaps universal than that. And so let me just give 2 or 3 examples. One is from NASA in the US, which we think of, it was the anniversary of the moon landing not that long ago, we think of as lots of men in white suits in a single building. But in fact, NASA's completely opened itself out. So for many of its tasks, whether it's designing a spacesuit or designing software to get a rocket to a new planet, they open the challenge up so anyone anywhere can contribute ideas and gets rewarded if their ideas are used. So they've really embedded collective intelligence into their everyday work in a way that no other public organization around the world has yet done. A very different example we've been working a bit with in East Africa is We Farm, which brings together well over 1 million farmers. So if one of them has a problem, they can post that problem in SMS. Then using AI and the collective intelligence of the farming community, they quickly find someone who may have an answer to how to manage a pest or a drought or something and get that answer to the farmer who first posed the question. So that's, again, organizing intelligence at large scale in some ways very simple technologies, but also a bit of sophistication. And weirdly, that is ahead of anything in Europe used yet for things like health and education and other fields. And another example from Taiwan is what they're doing to democracy. Democracy is under great stress in much of the world. People have lost confidence in democratic systems. And through things like V-Taiwan, the government and the parliament have opened up so hundreds of thousands of people can take part in deliberation and decision making. They can share what they think the facts are on an issue, what the options are, can deliberate, and then, only then, the ministers and parliaments make a decision. And when you see that in practice, it's kind of obvious that's where democracy has to go in the future, not just depending on what happens in an assembly or a parliament, let alone the brain of a president. So I guess my big interest now is how we really start embedding this, it's the thinking of governance as a brain shared between government itself and society, how we apply some of the methods now being used for COVID to things like climate change. And a few days ago, I published a paper on some of the things which could be being done at a city level using data, observation, analysis, experiment to speed up our achievement of net zero. And for us to recognize that almost anything which matters, we need new organizational models. I've called it mesh governance, which link the different tiers of government. Curated commons, where our shared knowledge and data is organized in a much more systematic way of use to everyone. And intelligence assemblies, where together we bring together the data, the analysis, the research, etc., in ways which are useful for the whole of society. Now, no government anywhere on the planet has yet organized itself around these concepts, but I think we'll start seeing some cities doing this, and then later on some national governments, and that will greatly enhance our shared ability to solve the big problems of the next few decades: climate change, aging, unemployment, inequality, or at least I hope so.
Geoff, thank you so much. This is really fascinating to get your take on all of this. I was just like one quick question, like you mentioned the paper that you just published on specifically on the focusing on cities as well, and what they can do on this level, what you can do. Can you give an example, one of your recommendations for this, like very specific?
Yeah, so one of the basic recommendations is for net zero, we need an entirely new legal and regulatory framework on data on carbon emissions, energy use, and so on. In my view, this should all become essentially open data, subject to sort of privacy protections, so that the city can see its own carbon behavior in real time. At the moment, for example, where I sit here in the UK, most of that data sits within private energy companies, private transport companies. There are no rules on opening it up and sharing it. Smart meter data, of which there's a huge amount across Europe, isn't yet being harnessed and orchestrated to help us see progress on climate change. There are equivalents in every other field where we need new ways of organizing that basic data, but also the knowledge of what actually works in retrofitting housing or running neighborhood energy. We're very, very backward in many ways in turning these basic ingredients of 21st century life into useful, usable common resources to help us solve problems.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Geoff. And with this, I will hand over to you now, Marleen, to also give us a bit of a taste for your work right now. You're also founder for many years. I just saw you also celebrated 25 years of WARC Society, your technological think and do tank and institute based in Amsterdam. I'm really excited to hear also, what you've prepared for us.
Yes, I think it can very much be complementary to what Geoff just told us. So I won't be discussing a totally different perspective, but I will share my screen. Hope it will work. And then you will see my presentation. Let's see if this works. So I guess you see. Oh, I have to go first. Yeah. So we recently developed a roadmap for the digital future for our parliament, because they were looking into our digital future and they realized they didn't have a clue what was going on. Because there are a lot of different, very complicated questions that are always also political. And I think it was basically, this is one of the problems that we have. Don't blockchain our babies, World Economic Forum, or we do not consent to your technocracy. So there is a tendency that people start not to believe the stories about the smart city, the data-driven policy, big data, artificial intelligence. So for a lot of people, that is a dystopian future. They don't believe that these kind of technologies will help, because we are living in a well, let's say a little nightmare because of all the platforms that have too much power. So if you now say, well, we need smart cities, then we believe this will be Google cities, and this is not something that we want. So I recently wrote a book, The Internet is Broken, which is trying to explain in how many ways the internet is broken, basically in our trust, but also it's vulnerable and has been exploited by both state and private parties. But luckily, I found a way to discuss that we can fix it. So we can, and I believe if we don't fix the internet, we can't fix our cities, because the internet is interwoven with everything, with mobility, with healthcare, with education, with policy, with democracy. So if we can't fix the internet, we will have also broken cities. So I think the story about technology and fixing it is the same story as trying to fix the problem around climate change and economic reform. So basically, there are 5 ways to do so, which is 1, changing the narrative and adding to the story that data could help us to understand ourselves better, is also to rethink what social intelligence means. And I believe artificial intelligence is not always the answer to the problems that we have. We have to break up big tech, which is, of course, one of the major issues that is not just based on national law, but we have to do this from a European perspective. And hopefully, I don't know, but maybe the Democrats will help us when the next elections will be won by them. And otherwise, we have a big problem. We have to reclaim economics, rethink, and I think I totally agree with Geoff that the commons should be at the center of that, and markets should organize themselves around commons, and not that we have to deal only with market activity. We have to think about innovation from a transformative perspective. So we have to think about where do we want to go, instead of just innovation that optimizes for the industry. And then if it's about the digital space, we have to refine our way back to the digital space, public space, which we have lost in the last 25 years. And this is how a lot of people experience the internet at the moment. They have applications, this is the way that we should go for, is that the technology that we have are open, that society is in control, that is regenerative, because there's a huge ecological footprint also of all the data that we're making, all the smartness that we are creating. We should think about data minimalization when it is related to the individual people, and it has to be fair and sustainable. And where we now is technology that is a black box, big tech is in control, there's extraction of value, there's surveillance capitalism, and there's human values and democracy at stake. So there's really something happening. So in this report, we made the idea of the iceberg to try to figure out what is underneath the citizens' perspective, which is both a technical stack, a design process, and of course the foundation. So let's start with the technical stack. This is, and I won't go into details because that we only have a few minutes now, but I think it's important to understand that each of these layers in the technology stack have to be addressed, both in the infrastructure, in the protocols, in the equipment and hardware, in operating systems, in the applications, in data algorithms, and so on. So this is not an easy task, but there are a lot of companies and organizations and public institutions that work on this. But I think there's an absolute necessity that we have public values in this in the technological stack, because otherwise we can't trust it. But then, of course, it starts with the foundation. And a lot of the assumptions are not always clarified. So who defines what are we optimizing for? Who controls the technology? Are fundamental rights and values inside of the process, or are they just an add-on? Are social economic considerations understood? In a sense, what is the financial gain? And of course, is governance and supervision inside of the design process, and not again as a sort of an add-on? So I would stress the idea of, if you think about smart cities, it's also about how we design and create technologies. And ethics are in the design process. So who can participate? Who defines the challenge? Who owns the outcomes? These are essential questions that are not always being raised when we talk about smartness. And we have to be very careful that we are not going to ethic washing. And I love this definition of Thomas Metzinger. Ethic washing is organizing and cultivating ethical debates, which can take a lot of time, this kind of debates, but in order to delay, postpone, avoid, deter from, or substitute for policy making and regulation. So I really think that we have to be very careful that we're not adding all kind of ethical commissions to the process. It has to be inside of the process, inside of the ownership, inside of the design process. But to move a bit, and I think I am very close to what Geoff is saying about how the process of this design should be. It should be citizens-led, should be public research, should be part of commoning and critical making, users as designers, citizen sensing. So the design process of technology should be based on key enabling design methodologies. And there's a lot already to be, so we should not focus on key enabling technologies, but we should start to focus on key enabling methodologies. I think this is really essential to change our idea about that, which means that we have to find a space for public research, for the matters of concern, for interdisciplinary approach, for society as a research community. And I think this cultural framing and society as a relevance for new outcomes and new innovations is part of this movement that we need if we want to reclaim our cities and reclaim technology. So also I come to the terms of, at the center of this whole thinking is reclaiming economics, going to regenerative models instead of extractive models, which means that the common should be really at the center of our 21st century economics. I think this picture, but I will maybe share it later on, is from Kate Raworth. I think she makes it very clear how state and market are not the only organizing principles for how to create value. And I think understanding city makers, society as value creation, the commons as space for sharing also these values are really important for the next phase in the next 21st century. And of course, I could go more into detail about the commons. The interesting part of the commons is that it both comes from ideas from land and nature, as it comes from more communities and culture, language, and so on. And of course also from code. So open source, open hardware, open technologies are part of the commons. So in the end, we have to think about creating a public stack. When I talk, I'm back in the stack story about the technology, that all the technologies that are inside of our societies, are inside of cities, are based on public values, and that we have to move away from the private stack, which is closed stack, or state stack, which is mostly also closed technology. So again, we should move away from privately owned or state-owned technologies, and we have to move into public-owned technologies. And that would mean that we then might have very soon, because it's possible, there are a lot of different good examples already, that we will move into a safe and just future, not just a digital future from a citizen's perspective. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Marleen. Maybe just since you just mentioned there's so many good examples as well, do you have an example to share with us also that specifically leverages, let's say, the public stack, and it's not based on a closed system, but also, you know, where you feel there is maybe some innovation in terms of the business model, where you can still, you know, you can grow, you can scale a solution, but it is actually, it embodies those ethics, those data ethics you're mentioning.
Well, there are a lot of different examples, both from cultural organizations and social media. So let's say you can use the Brave browser instead of all the other browsers. You can use Signal instead of WhatsApp. So there are a lot of you can use Proton Mail instead of Google Mail. So there are already a lot of good examples. And I believe from a city perspective, what we work on here in Amsterdam are data commons for mobility. And I think then I'm on the same track as Geoff is that there's a lot of ways to govern data commons and to govern public and open artificial intelligence systems. So I think this is the way to make it practical and to make it happen. So it means that it's not state-owned, which is maybe for some people a relief. Commons-owned means that you can build this around cooperative structures, but the state has to, of course, secure that it stays a commons, and that's cannot be privatized. And there are very good examples how market activity can services can also thrive around open technologies or open source. So it doesn't mean that you exclude the market. You'd say it should be part of the public ownership. So you can't appropriate the commons, but you can build services around the commons, which means that it's also opening up to a lot of different entrepreneurs to create value around a commons.
I mean, we also work very closely with entrepreneurs, and indeed, especially if you look at a lot of, for instance, those transport solution providers, a lot of them actually, they base their whole scaling strategy on open data sets in order to like bring their services quickly to other cities. So I think that's probably also good example. But Geoff, I would like to ask you as well, in terms of data commons, governing data, why is it so difficult for us here in the UK, in Germany, in Europe, maybe perhaps, yeah, why do we seem to struggle, and more than maybe in other parts?
Well, we've done some things right. As you say, the transport story for the last 12, 13 years is a good one, where cities like London opened up their transport data and loads of entrepreneurs created really good, useful tools off the back of it. They were much better at doing that than the city authority would have been, but it's entrepreneurship resting on a commons. I hope we'll see similar things around the labour market. And one of the things I've been working on a lot in the last 2 or 3 years is how we get much more better orchestration of data on skills, jobs, what's growing, what's shrinking, to create a parallel to what happened in transport in that field. But I think one of the problems we've got is one Marleen pointed out. We've had this huge explosion of AI ethics work in the last few years, but very little serious work on the practical issues of governing the commons, governing the data, let alone detailed thinking about what to do about regulating AI. In fact, I'm amazed how empty that field is compared to often slightly theoretical and not very useful speculation about the ethics of AI. And within our cities, although there are obviously sometimes quite good digital teams, they're not yet really involved at the truly strategic level. And for example, on climate change, it's still essentially different teams working on energy and getting carbon out from the teams working on digital and data. And that's why not so much progress has been made, let alone skills in how you systematically organize collective intelligence, involve the brain power of the whole world in solving problems. So I think we need a shift of mindset, shifts of capability, but then I hope a proliferation of experiment in how to use these new ways of working.
And indeed, I think even London, they just recently announced they're working towards a data kind of AI framework, which they want to sort of like, have as the basis for any innovative or advanced urban service being deployed in the city, which I found very, very intriguing. We don't have it here in Germany yet, something like this. So I was very pleased to see this. I think also ties very well into your idea, what you mentioned, Geoff, about meshed governance. And I'm wondering though, like, also to you, Marleen, because you've been involved in a big European project tackling actually exactly those topics around this, which was called DeCODE. Maybe you can also say a few words about DeCODE, because it seems like the funding is there. We are bringing the right people together in Europe to talk to each other. But what's still like what's keeping us, if we actually know what the solution looks like or should look like, what's keeping us from implementing it more quickly?
Yeah, well, what DeCODE showed is that what DeCODE did is a lot of different things at the same time. It brought people together on this topic of sovereignty, and of course, very much also that Europe should choose for building up its own platform technology on basis, of course, of open standards, and not as sort of like having an exclusive part of the internet, but that it has to be engaged in this discussion and should not wait for the Silicon Valley or China or any other huge powerhouse in the technology field. And what DeCODE also showed is that on the level of a protocol, you can make decisions that it has political impact. And we also saw it now with the COVID app, which every country built something for tracking and tracing proximity. And there's a big difference if you create it on the basis of the protocol DP3T, or that some were still working on the PEPPT, which is, well, like this, abbreviations are always difficult, but the one is a centralized protocol where data is based and stored on a central server. And DP3T is where it's being distributed and it is presented on your mobile phone. And I think we show that it's possible. So that technology partners, but it's a lot of engagement coming from society. So we have Code for NL, for example, here in the Netherlands, which are hundreds of people that are volunteering to help the government to make the right decisions. So they did some assessment on the code base. They were discussing the user journey. They were defining what kind of protocol would be best. So I think this kind of new engagements are really important, and the capacities are there in Europe. What I do believe is that with programs like Next Generation Internet, there is some funding. This is crucial, but we also need to have policies that helps us to create this market demand, like from the public sector. So if the public sector starts to demand to have safe and secure platforms for education, for culture, for cities, then we will also free up a lot of funding to pay the companies that come up with technologies that are based on these public values and that have oversight and that are not black boxes. So we have to do a lot of different things at the same time. And at the moment, the platforms that we use at the moment are so powerful. There's so much money gathered around the Ubers of this world. A lot of this kind of capital comes from oil and has the same type of extractive nature as we have to. We all are already dealing with climate problems and the companies that are still keeping on to their old business models. So this is not an easy solution. This is not one single silver bullet that can help us. So it has to be an orchestrated effort on a lot of different levels. And I think the story about commons as central to markets, I think this is a very important part which can help us to both make a secure digital future as a secure planet.
Perhaps I could add to that, because like Marleen, I was involved in both DeCODE and the next generation internet in my previous job at Nesta. In a way, what's happened in Europe is we had this very extractive, predatory model of the digital and data in the big platforms like Google and Facebook, which in a way has run its course. The failure of Google's Sidewalk Labs in Toronto was a really important moment when essentially the public said, we don't want that vision of the smart city. Against that, in Europe, there was a very strong emphasis then on privacy, stopping data flows, GDPR, data sovereignty, which was a good counter, but in its own way was a bit of a dead end, because if you don't let data link up, you don't get the full benefits of intelligence, which all depends on connectivity. So I think the next generation is about taking the commons seriously and sometimes organizing data as a public good, not allowing every individual to decide entirely what data about them is used everywhere, though giving them some rights and controls and following principles of data minimization. But there's still a bit of a mindset block where I think we're still in some ways fighting those battles against the big platforms and therefore not reaping the value of a much smarter, much more interconnected system, which you can see why that is so important on public health. I think climate change is almost inconceivable. We will make fast enough progress without a leap to a different model of shared data. And I think cities have to be at the forefront of that leap, but it's a bit of a mental leap. And at the moment, there simply aren't the options on the table for cities about how to do it. So we need much more serious, concrete thinking, not just kind of rhetorical, about exactly how do you organize data and knowledge around a care system, around carbon and energy and so on. And that's what makes this field exciting, is there's actually rather more questions than answers right now.
No, I think it's a fascinating debate, especially since Marleen, you also called it the reclaiming the economics of it, and I think this is often something that I also we are confronted with in our day-to-day work with startups, because you just think of the global startup ecosystem and how it works. It's all about like venture capital funding, most of the time. Obviously we do have like also good like public funding early stage in Europe, but then often in the end, when you want to have fast growth, fast deployment, you also need this kind of risky capital. And the question is, can there be risky capital for the good social purpose? And this would be my question to both of you, and maybe both of you, maybe also how we could maybe it's a new kind of funding, it's a new kind of mentality around it, but I would love to hear your thoughts on this.
Well, go on.
No, I don't believe that type of venture capital can do good. It's impossible because there are strings attached. There is an idea how that has to flourish. So that type of money is based on extraction of value. And I think a lot of the young entrepreneurs that are they're little fish that are already being eaten by the big fish at the moment that they accept venture capital or risk funding. So I believe this is part of the old economic model, and I think we really should free up all this creativity and entrepreneurship of these great young people or older people and make them part of something else, another movement, which is regenerative. And I hope this will work also for Europe, because I think this is totally a dead end at the moment. And I'm not against entrepreneurship, but I believe it's really a pity how so much energy ends up in the pockets of the big companies that will just buy up all the innovations that you did. So I don't believe in that direction. And I do believe that it's possible to do good, and I think we are obliged to do so. But people that are in technology should really move away from this story that technology will solve everything. So to be a critical person in this respect, instead of like a believer or just like an evangelist. Because only critical in the sense of not saying being against the technology, but being critical in the sense that you can make a difference between what is your assumptions, where are we optimizing for, who is in control, who owns the solutions, and what is my own stake in that, and why am I trying to achieve this? I think this kind of ideas, and definitely in a time of understanding our own privilege, it's really important that we understand that also when you're in tech and you are an entrepreneur in technology, or if you're in a city council, you have to understand that your own privilege is now defining the technologies that will have effect on a lot of people that were not part of the design process. And I think this design process of our culture and our technology should be at the heart of our future.
So I'd probably take a slightly different view. So on balance, I think the startup scenes, which grew up in Silicon Valley, now in many cities across Europe, have been a good thing. They've unleashed creativity. They've challenged the big incumbent power structures in entirely healthy ways. But the thing about capitalism is it's a system which both rewards predatory behavior and creative behavior. And you can see that in Google. Google, in many ways, I think is not a purely predatory model. It's hugely beneficial to us to have search engines, Google Maps, all the things we use every day. But it also has been predatory in its use of data. And so I think the old-fashioned black-white binary thinking doesn't really help you here. I think what we do need is some kinds of venture capital. We do need a startup scene. But we need to recognize that in some whole industries that becomes damaging. The founder of Spotify is worth 2.5 billion, but Spotify has become very successful partly because musicians don't get paid. It's sucked money out of the music system. We don't need oligopolies. We do need to open up the big platforms. But I think, as I say, the old models where it was always so capitalism, evil and predatory and something else good doesn't help us. We need these much more open systems, which the startup scene are part of, which mobilize imagination and creativity better than governments do on their own. But we mustn't fall for their own myths and stories where they are the solvers of every possible problem. And that's the kind of, I think, nuance, perhaps it's slightly sort of dual thinking, which I think is vital for us getting through these dilemmas. Otherwise, we risk killing some of the very sources of creativity we need to solve our big problems.
And I guess also it goes back to the idea, right, that we just need new modes, new models of like work better together, because I think we are still like pretty much stuck, you know, in those different silos or in those different bubbles, be it the public policy bubble, and then on the other side, the startup bubble. So I'm also wondering, Geoff, you have this idea of the metaphor, kind of the city as a brain. Like, what does it mean in practical terms for, let's say, the day-to-day work of someone working in the local government? How can they activate this brain?
So going back to something Marleen said, I think the problem often with like smart city discussions is it focuses on the technology, the AI, the hardware, and everyone gets excited by that. I think we should flip that on its head and think of intelligence as an outcome. What does it look like for a city actually to be intelligent in how, let's say, it handles loneliness amongst the elderly, or it could be carbon reduction. And if you're looking at, let's say, elderly loneliness and care as an important issue facing every city in the world, then you need to think systemically. That may be about making sure you're aware of what's happening, organizing data, organizing experience, feedback from the experience of older people, not just from tech and so on. It means organizing experimentation to try new things out. It means learning the knowledge about what really makes a difference to people's lives. And it means turning public procurement into a tool which can fund startups who think they've got a fantastic way of improving the lives of older people, test them out in practice. If they're successful, help them grow, spread. If they're not, don't back them. So it means almost in any field, thinking of it as a system and thinking of all the different elements of intelligence, which are, as I say, things like observation, data, models, memory, creativity. How is that being organized at a city scale? How is it being turned both into a commons where that's relevant, but also motivating people, which could be the old people themselves, their carers, could be startups, to offer solutions, but then test them objectively. See if they actually work, reward them if they do, and if they don't give them any more money. So I think this idea of intelligence as a brain becomes practical in almost any field, but the key is always looping back to intelligence as an outcome, not as an input, and not getting fixated on any particular bit of software or hardware as the magic solution, because it's likely to disappoint if you do that.
It's quite funny that you I totally see your core argument that intelligence is an outcome and not in itself. But funny is city as a brain. I would say the city as a body, or as we now understand that part of our emotions and our intelligence comes from the gut. So there is like this combination of brain and gut. So I think sometimes tend to think that all our intelligence is in the brain, and then we believe that the computer is like the overarching idea about how intelligence is organized. But we have a lot of, I think we have to integrate our knowledge with social intelligence, with emotional intelligence. And then if we think about some of the problems that are there, which is, for example, we don't know, poverty, for example, then sometimes thinking that data would solve us, then actually the moment that we need data to understand poverty, we have another problem at stake, which is that we have not enough knowledge, social intelligence in our cities anymore. So I sometimes believe that the solution is to organize our societies differently than creating data about the society. And I'm again, for a lot of reasons, I believe that data can help. But for some of the problems we have, it is that we're trying to solve something on the wrong scale, and that we have to come up with social solutions, emotional solutions, than to come with data-driven solutions. And I sometimes also believe that startups are not the right answer, but more community-driven activities are. And so if the startups have the wrong incentives to deal with poverty, for example, I sometimes believe that we are doing the wrong thing there. So we should sort of more vitalize the commons, but also the social structures in cities, and not see it as a part of the tech revolution.
So I'd actually agree with that. When I talk of government as a brain, or the city as a brain, I mean the brain as we understand it in 2020, which is very different from the way brains were thought of 10, 20, 30 years ago. On the one hand, as Marleen said, the brain is no longer thought of as just cognition. It's emotion, it's empathy, it's your gut, it's your heart, as well as your head. That's the truth of the brain. And it used to be thought the brain had a kind of control room, like a sort of Houston central command in the middle of it. Now we understand brains are actually much more modular. They're full of competing and cooperating elements. And that's a much better metaphor for how a city should think, rather than the sort of mayor sitting at a control room and organizing everything. And again, as Marleen said, one of the things we've learned about poverty in all sorts of fields is if you only have second or third order data, you're almost certainly missing out on lots of relevant lived experience. And a much better way of thinking is directly experientially. And so the experience, whether it's of an isolated older person, someone who's heavily in debt, someone who's been unemployed for a few years, go directly to their voice, their experience, rather than only relying on second order data and statistics. I mean, I'd hope all of these should be sort of obvious to people running cities nowadays. And they're very different from the technocratic top-down sort of command versions of the 60s. But I think that's where the metaphor of thinking as a brain gets exciting, when it's the 2020 brain, not the kind of 1970 brain of, yeah, perhaps running the moon landing or something like that. That is a misleading image.
And
for people not to rethink what you mean by brain. So maybe then it's the intelligent body, to see a city as a body, as a well, an ecosystem or an entanglement, as a fungi. I think I like the whole concept of the wood wide web, or the way that trees are talking and fungi are talking with each other and helping each other out. Maybe it helps us to find other metaphors, because the brain metaphor, sometimes a lot of people will still believe that this is this artificial hand coming to touch the human hand, this image, but this one is then a computer hand, like the robot hand. So we have to come up with other types of solutions. We also have to build other narratives. And I do understand what you mean. I think I totally agree with you, but still the metaphor that you use could end up on the wrong side of the story that I think we should together tell.
I think it's a really good, maybe if I can come in here, I think it's a really good point, about the narratives. I mean, my experience is it's very hard for public servants, or it's very rare that you see them actually being able to tell those new kinds of narratives. Like, how do you go about this? Because, just again, like in the day-to-day reality of a civic leader, what are the new kind of narratives they should be telling in order to speak the language of like commons, of data preserving systems, new kind of design processes, inclusive processes, and so on. Because I think there will have to be a very different narrative that's also convincing them to really switch around the whole economic model, to go maybe more to a donut economy and so on. Like, do you have any tips for the creative bureaucrat?
Yeah, well, maybe just one final point. So we've been working with the United Nations, training up a lot of teams around the world using collective intelligence methods for the Sustainable Development Goals in very, very different contexts. And I think the simple narrative, which seems to make sense in most places, is kind of an obvious one. If you're faced with any problem, it could be water shortages or unemployment, think right from the start, what are the resources of intelligence we could be using? And those resources will be very varied. Some will be very techy, sensor data from satellite data and so on. But some will be in the brains of the people experiencing the problem. Some will be in the brains of the professionals. And harness that to better understand the problem, harness it to get a better range of solutions you can be using, harness it as you're then testing and experimenting with these solutions. And I think it'll just be common sense in the future that good government, almost the mark of good government in a city or anywhere else, is it makes the most of the intelligence around it. And at the moment, most bureaucracies simply do not use 95% of the potential intelligence in all its senses that is at their disposal. And that is like throwing oil away, or like throwing buildings away, or like throwing machinery away. It's incredibly wasteful. And anyway, that's the starting point of a narrative which I would encourage people to use.
Yes, I think what I see, which is coming up and is connected to the whole idea of the commons, is that, and maybe also the term public research that I introduced, is also the term of city maker. There are a lot of people that are concerned and that try to play a role and can play a role in a lot of the different issues. So there's a whole citizen science or citizen sensing movement where citizens also create data to understand the ecological situation of the city, like for healthcare or for other reasons. So if you activate citizens to be part of the process of research and innovation, and not just see them as consumers or subject to the government, if you see them as being able to actively involve and create also part of the solution. And I think there's another term that Geoff and I know from the past, also from your Nesta experience, social innovation. If this public engagement in this process is taken care of, you can create a totally different relationship between the knowledge that is in society and what is in the government. Because at the moment, when we talk about the public-private partnership, for example, the government believes they are the public, but they are not. They should be the organizing principle between market and public. So I sometimes believe that if the creative bureaucracy should be able to understand how to activate, and I totally agree with the idea of a lot of different intelligence in a city, but especially to activate the citizens' intelligence and to make them part of the process. And I think therefore these key enabling methodologies are very essential, because there's so many ways to do so. And there's a lot of knowledge about how these design processes can be shaped and what you can expect from them, so that you can be a bit more specific about how citizens could be participating in innovation. But I believe there is again, I agree, an enormous potential which is now wasted. And I think there's this idea that we all have to deal with triple helix, that the government has to deal with companies and science to come up with solutions. But I really believe now in this 21st century, this is an old Ouzo idea, but we have to move into that. We have that governments work with public research, and then from there you can build both markets and commons.
Fantastic. So maybe as a last question, also for our discussion today, all right. I'm just hearing we unfortunately don't have time for last question, but so thank you. Thanks a lot. Geoff, Marleen, it was an incredibly fruitful discussion. I certainly learned a lot. I'm sure our viewers have as well. And I encourage everyone to look into the work of Marleen and Geoff in more detail. There is a incredible amount of thought out there on the internet from your work. I really enjoyed diving deep into this with you, and I hope we can continue this discussion soon.
Take care.
Take care.
Thank you so much. Good luck.